Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story, The Yellowed Pages of Dr. Josiah Brennan's personal journal, discovered in 1923 within the sealed walls of the abandoned Millbrook State Asylum, contained entries that would forever alter the understanding of institutional medicine in 19th century America. Written in meticulous script between October 1886 and March 1887, these documents revealed the systematic deterioration of what had once been considered Kentucky's most progressive mental health facility. Brennan had arrived at Millbrook in the autumn of 1886, recruited from the prestigious McLean Hospital in Massachusetts to serve as the institution's new superintendent. His credentials were impeccable. A graduate of Harvard Medical School, published researcher in the emerging field of alienism, and advocate for the moral treatment of the mentally afflicted. The Kentucky State Board of Health had specifically sought his expertise to address mounting concerns about conditions at their largest asylum. The facility itself stood as a monument to mid-century optimism about mental health treatment. Constructed in 1854 on 200 acres of rolling Kentucky countryside, Millbrook had been designed according to the Kirkbride Plan, a revolutionary architectural approach that emphasized natural light, proper ventilation, and therapeutic environments. The imposing Gothic Revival structure, with its central administration building flanked by symmetrical patient wings, had once housed nearly 400 souls under the care of a dedicated medical staff. However, by the time of Brennan's appointment, the asylum bore little resemblance to its founding vision. State funding had been systematically reduced throughout the 1870s and early 1880s, forcing the institution to accept far more patients than its infrastructure could accommodate. What had been designed for careful therapeutic intervention had devolved into mere custodial warehousing of Kentucky's most vulnerable citizens. Brennan's initial observations, recorded with clinical precision in his journal, painted a disturbing portrait of institutional decay. Patient records had been poorly maintained for years, with many individuals admitted without proper documentation of their conditions or treatment histories. The medical staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, 3 physicians attempting to provide care for nearly 600 patients, many of whom suffered from conditions ranging from melancholia and dementia to what contemporary medicine would later recognize as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. The physical deterioration of the facility proved equally troubling. The heating system, installed during the original construction, had fallen into disrepair, leaving entire wings inadequately warmed during the harsh Kentucky winters. Plumbing failures had become commonplace, creating unsanitary conditions that violated every principle of modern medical practice. Most concerning to Brennan was the discovery that the asylum's morgue had been operating beyond capacity for months, with bodies stored in makeshift facilities throughout the basement levels. Perhaps most disturbing were the personnel records Brennan uncovered during his first weeks at Millbrook. The previous superintendent, Dr. Thaddeus Crane, had departed abruptly in June 1886 under circumstances that remained deliberately obscured in official documentation. Several attendants and nurses had similarly vanished from employment without proper notice or forwarding addresses. Those staff members who remained spoke in hushed tones about incidents they refused to detail, their eyes carrying the haunted expression of individuals who had witnessed events beyond their capacity to process. The patient population itself presented challenges that extended far beyond conventional medical understanding. Brennan noted unusual behavioral patterns among residents of the Eastern Wing, a section that housed individuals diagnosed with various forms of dementia and chronic melancholia. These patients exhibited synchronized episodes of agitation that occurred with disturbing regularity, typically during the pre-dawn hours when the asylum lay shrouded in Kentucky's characteristic autumn mists. Local records from the surrounding community revealed additional layers of complexity. The town of Millbrook, which had initially welcomed the asylum as a source of employment and economic stability, had grown increasingly isolated from the institution. Merchants reported difficulties in maintaining regular deliveries to the facility, citing unexplained equipment failures and the reluctance of their employees to venture onto the asylum grounds. The local cemetery had recorded an unusual number of burials from the institution, though official death certificates often listed causes of death in vague terms that suggested either medical incompetence or deliberate obfuscation. Brennan's methodical documentation would prove prophetic in ways he could not have anticipated. His journal entries from those early weeks at Millbrook captured not merely the decline of a medical institution, but the emergence of something far more sinister, a convergence of human suffering, institutional failure, and circumstances that defied rational explanation. The superintendent's commitment to scientific observation and careful record-keeping would ultimately provide the only reliable account of the events that would unfold over the following months, transforming Millbrook State Asylum from a forgotten footnote in Kentucky's medical history into a cautionary tale that would haunt the American psychiatric establishment for generations to come. Dr. Brennan's investigation into the asylum's operational irregularities intensified during his second week at Millbrook, when he began conducting systematic evaluations of the patient population. His medical training had prepared him for the challenges of treating severe mental illness, but nothing in his experience at McLean Hospital had equipped him to understand the peculiar circumstances he encountered in the institution's eastern wing. The wing housed 47 patients, predominantly elderly individuals, suffering from various forms of senile dementia and chronic melancholia. According to the fragmentary records maintained by the previous administration, most had been transferred to this section between 1884 and 1885, during a period when overcrowding had necessitated the consolidation of patients with similar diagnoses. The wing's isolation from the main facility had been justified as a therapeutic measure, designed to provide a quieter environment for those whose conditions required minimal stimulation. However, Brennan's clinical observations revealed patterns that contradicted conventional understanding of these disorders. The patients exhibited a remarkable degree of behavioral synchronization that extended far beyond the typical institutional routines. They would cease their various activities simultaneously, often turning their attention toward the wing's eastern windows with an intensity that suggested purposeful observation rather than the vacant staring commonly associated with advanced dementia. These episodes occurred with clockwork regularity, typically beginning at 4:30 in the morning and lasting precisely 17 minutes. During these periods, the wing would fall into an unnatural silence, broken only by the soft shuffling of feet as patients positioned themselves at optimal vantage points. Brennan noted that even those individuals who normally required assistance with basic mobility would navigate independently to the windows, displaying coordination that seemed impossible given their documented cognitive impairments. The eastern windows overlooked a section of the asylum grounds that had been abandoned since the early 1880s. Originally intended as a therapeutic garden where patients could engage in horticultural activities, the area had fallen into neglect due to budget constraints and staffing shortages. Wild vegetation had reclaimed the formal pathways, creating a dense tangle of native Kentucky flora that obscured much of the landscape beyond. A small stone structure, identified in architectural plans as a gardener's shed, stood partially concealed among the overgrown plantings. Brennan's attempts to understand the patient's fixation on this particular view led him to examine the wing's historical records more thoroughly. He discovered that the behavioral pattern had first been documented in September 1884, shortly after the arrival of a patient named Jeremiah Voss. The 73-year-old former minister had been committed following a series of incidents in his rural parish that local authorities had attributed to advancing senility and religious mania. Voss's admission records, though incomplete, suggested a man whose mental faculties had deteriorated rapidly following the death of his wife in the summer of 1884. Parishioners had reported increasingly erratic sermons in which the elderly minister spoke of receiving divine communications through dreams and visions. His final documented public appearance involved an attempt to conduct a burial service for individuals who were demonstrably alive, an incident that had prompted his family to seek institutional care. The correlation between Voss's arrival and the onset of the synchronized behaviors among other Eastern Wing residents proved troubling to Brennan's scientific sensibilities. Medical literature contained no precedent for such rapid transmission of behavioral patterns among patients with severe cognitive impairments. The phenomenon suggested either an unknown form of psychological contagion or the influence of environmental factors that had not been properly identified. Brennan's investigation of the abandoned garden area revealed additional anomalies that deepened his concern. The soil composition showed unusual mineral concentrations that differed significantly from samples taken elsewhere on the asylum grounds. Local geological surveys had noted similar irregularities in the surrounding countryside, attributing them to the region's complex limestone formations and underground water systems. However, the specific combination of elements found in the garden soil had no documented precedent in Kentucky's geological record. The stone structure within the overgrown garden presented its own mysteries. Architectural records indicated that it had been constructed in 1856 as a simple storage facility for gardening implements and supplies. However, Brennan's examination revealed modifications that had been made without official authorization sometime during the early 1880s. The building's interior had been altered to include what appeared to be a crude ventilation system, with pipes extending deep into the ground beneath the foundation. Most disturbing was Brennan's discovery of personal effects within the structure, items that belonged to former asylum staff members who had departed under mysterious circumstances. Among these artifacts were medical instruments, patient records, and a collection of handwritten notes that documented observations similar to his own regarding the Eastern Wing patients' unusual behaviors. The implications of these findings forced Brennan to confront the possibility that Millbrook's problems extended far beyond administrative neglect and inadequate funding. The systematic nature of the anomalies suggested deliberate concealment of information that might explain the institution's deteriorating conditions and the mysterious circumstances surrounding previous staff departures. The personal effects discovered within the abandoned garden structure included a leather-bound journal that would prove instrumental in Brennan's understanding of the asylum's deteriorating conditions. The journal belonged to Dr. Silas Meredith, the institution's former chief physician who had served under the previous superintendent until his unexplained departure in May 1886. Meredith's meticulous documentation provided the first coherent account of the events that had preceded Brennan's arrival at Millbrook. Meredith's entries began in January 1885, approximately 4 months after Jeremiah Voss had been admitted to the Eastern Wing. The physician's initial observations focused on what he termed collective behavioral modifications among the wing's residents. Unlike Brennan's clinical detachment, Meredith's writing revealed growing personal distress as he struggled to reconcile his medical training with phenomena that defied conventional explanation. The former minister's influence on his fellow patients had manifested gradually, beginning with subtle changes in their daily routines. Individuals who had previously shown no interest in religious observance began displaying behaviors that suggested spiritual preoccupation. They would position themselves in prayer-like postures during the synchronized window observations, their lips moving in silent recitation of words that attendants could not discern. Meredith had attempted to document these recitations through careful observation and lip-reading techniques learned during his medical training. His notes revealed fragments of what appeared to be Latin phrases, though the pronunciation seemed corrupted by the patient's various speech impediments and cognitive limitations. The physician's linguistic analysis suggested possible connections to medieval ecclesiastical texts, though he acknowledged his limited expertise in theological matters. The behavioral changes had accelerated following an incident in March 1885, when Voss had suffered what attendants initially interpreted as a severe epileptic seizure. The episode had occurred during one of the morning window observations, with the elderly minister collapsing while the other patients maintained their vigil. Medical examination revealed no physical trauma, but Voss had emerged from the incident with enhanced cognitive clarity that contradicted his documented diagnosis of progressive dementia. This improvement in Voss's mental faculties had coincided with the appearance of new symptoms among other Eastern Wing residents. Patients who had previously required assistance with basic functions began demonstrating unexpected capabilities. They would navigate the wing's corridors with purpose and coordination, gathering in specific locations at predetermined times without any apparent external cues or instructions. Meredith's documentation revealed that these gatherings centered around activities that bore disturbing resemblances to religious rituals. The patients would arrange themselves in circular formations, with Voss positioned at the center despite his advanced age and physical frailty. They would remain motionless for extended periods, their attention focused on the former minister as he appeared to communicate through gestures and expressions rather than spoken words. The physician's attempts to interrupt these gatherings had proven unsuccessful and increasingly dangerous. Patients who had previously shown no signs of aggressive behavior would become violently agitated when separated from the group activities. Several attendants had sustained injuries during intervention attempts, leading to a policy of non-interference that effectively allowed the behaviors to continue unchecked. Meredith's journal entries from the summer of 1885 documented his growing conviction that external factors were influencing the patient's conditions. His investigation of the asylum's physical environment had revealed structural anomalies that had not been noted in previous inspections. The Eastern Wing's foundation showed signs of settling that suggested underground disturbances, possibly related to the region's limestone cave systems. More troubling were Meredith's observations regarding the wing's acoustic properties. Sound seemed to carry differently within the affected areas, with whispered conversations audible at impossible distances, while normal speech often became muffled and indistinct. The physician had conducted crude experiments using musical instruments and found that certain frequencies produced resonant effects that appeared to agitate the patient significantly. The journal's most disturbing entries concerned Meredith's discovery of unauthorized modifications to the wing's infrastructure. Someone had installed a network of narrow pipes within the walls, creating a primitive communication system that connected various patient rooms to the abandoned garden structure. The pipes appeared to have been installed during the night hours when the wing was minimally staffed, though no work orders or maintenance records documented their construction. Meredith's investigation of these modifications had led him to examine the garden structure more thoroughly, revealing evidence of regular nocturnal activities that had gone undetected by the asylum's security protocols. The ground around the building showed signs of frequent disturbance, with patterns that suggested systematic excavation and refilling of specific areas. The physician's final entries, dated in early May 1886, revealed his growing fear that the situation at Millbrook had progressed beyond medical intervention. His attempts to communicate his concerns to the superintendent had been dismissed as professional stress and overwork. Colleagues had begun avoiding him, and he suspected that his movements within the facility were being monitored by unknown parties. Meredith's last documented observation concerned his discovery that patient records were being systematically altered to obscure the true nature of their conditions and behaviors. Dr. Brennan's examination of Meredith's journal compelled him to investigate the physical infrastructure of Millbrook with unprecedented thoroughness. Armed with architectural blueprints dating to the asylum's original construction, he began a systematic survey of the eastern wing that would reveal the true scope of the unauthorized modifications his predecessor had documented. The building's basement levels, originally designed to house mechanical systems and storage facilities, had been extensively altered through what appeared to be decades of clandestine construction. The official blueprints showed a straightforward layout of boiler rooms, cold storage areas, and utility corridors. However, Brennan's exploration revealed a complex network of additional passages that connected the eastern wing to areas far beyond the asylum's documented boundaries. These tunnels had been excavated with remarkable precision, following the natural contours of the limestone bedrock that characterized the region's geology. The workmanship suggested professional mining expertise rather than the crude efforts of asylum patients or staff. Support beams had been installed using techniques consistent with commercial excavation projects, and the passages showed evidence of regular maintenance that indicated ongoing use. Brennan's investigation led him to discover that the tunnel system extended beneath the abandoned garden area and continued toward a series of natural caves that honeycombed the countryside surrounding Millbrook. Local geological surveys had documented these formations as part of Kentucky's extensive karst topography, but none had noted their proximity to the asylum or their potential connection to the institution's infrastructure. The caves themselves presented an environment that defied conventional understanding of subterranean ecosystems. Despite their depth and isolation from surface water sources, they maintained atmospheric conditions that seemed artificially regulated. Temperature and humidity levels remained remarkably consistent, suggesting the presence of ventilation systems that had not been documented in any official records. More disturbing were the modifications that had been made to the cave interiors. Natural chambers had been enlarged and connected through carefully constructed passages that created a vast underground complex. Stone platforms had been erected at strategic locations, their surfaces worn smooth by what appeared to be centuries of use rather than recent construction. Brennan's exploration of these chambers revealed artifacts that challenged his understanding of the asylum's history. Among the items he discovered were religious texts dating to the colonial period, medical instruments of unfamiliar design, and collections of human remains that showed signs of deliberate arrangement rather than natural deposition. The remains themselves presented puzzles that extended beyond Brennan's medical expertise. While some appeared to be of recent origin, others showed evidence of preservation techniques that suggested much greater antiquity. The positioning of the skeletal remains followed patterns that resembled ritualistic arrangements, though Brennan's limited knowledge of anthropological practices prevented him from drawing definitive conclusions about their significance. Most troubling was his discovery of documentation that indicated the cave system had been known to asylum administrators since the institution's founding. Letters between the original architects and state officials revealed discussions about the underground formations and their potential impact on the building's structural integrity. However, these concerns had apparently been dismissed in favor of economic considerations that prioritized rapid construction over thorough geological assessment. The correspondence also revealed that Jeremiah Voss had not been the first minister to be committed to Millbrook under suspicious circumstances. Records dating to the 1860s documented the admission of several clergy members whose conditions had been attributed to religious mania and senile dementia. These individuals had all been housed in the Eastern Wing, and their cases showed remarkable similarities to the behavioral patterns Brennan had observed among current patients. Further investigation revealed that the asylum's mortality rates had fluctuated in cycles that corresponded to the arrival and departure of these religious figures. Periods of increased deaths were consistently followed by intervals of relative stability, suggesting a pattern that extended far beyond normal institutional variations in patient health. Brennan's analysis of burial records from the local cemetery revealed additional anomalies that deepened his concern about the asylum's operations. Many of the graves attributed to Millbrook patients contained remains that showed signs of post-mortem disturbance. Coffins had been opened and resealed, often multiple times, and the condition of the remains suggested that bodies had been removed and returned to their burial sites. The cemetery's groundskeeper, an elderly man named Tobias Fletcher, who had maintained the facility since the 1850s, had documented these irregularities in personal records that he had never reported to local authorities. Fletcher's notes revealed his growing suspicion that asylum staff were conducting unauthorized activities within the cemetery during nighttime hours. These activities appeared to coincide with the synchronized behaviors that Brennan had observed among the Eastern Wing patients. Fletcher's documentation showed that disturbances in the cemetery occurred with the same regularity as the morning window observations, suggesting a coordination between events at the asylum and activities in the burial grounds. The implications of these discoveries forced Brennan to confront the possibility that Millbrook's problems were not the result of recent administrative failures, but rather the continuation of practices that had been established during the institution's earliest years. Tobias Fletcher's private records, maintained in a weathered ledger hidden within the cemetery's maintenance shed, provided Brennan with documentation that spanned 3 decades of suspicious activities surrounding Millbrook State Asylum. The groundskeeper's meticulous observations revealed patterns of nocturnal disturbances that had escalated dramatically following the arrival of each ministerial patient committed to the Eastern Wing. Fletcher's earliest entries, dating to 1858, described routine cemetery maintenance complicated by occasional evidence of unauthorized grave access. Initially, these incidents appeared sporadic and potentially attributable to grave robbers seeking valuable burial goods or medical students requiring anatomical specimens. However, the groundskeeper's detailed documentation revealed that the disturbances followed specific patterns that suggested more systematic purposes. The activities intensified significantly during the 1860s, coinciding with the admission of Reverend Cornelius Thorne, a Methodist minister whose commitment had been precipitated by claims of divine revelation and attempts to resurrect deceased parishioners. Fletcher's records indicated that grave disturbances increased 3-fold during Thorne's residency at the asylum, with particular attention focused on burial sites containing the remains of individuals who had died under unusual circumstances. Fletcher had begun conducting covert surveillance of the cemetery during this period, positioning himself in concealed locations that allowed observation of the burial grounds during the pre-dawn hours when the disturbances typically occurred. His accounts described figures moving among the graves with purposeful coordination, carrying implements that suggested excavation activities rather than simple vandalism. The groundskeeper's observations revealed that these nocturnal visitors possessed intimate knowledge of the cemetery's layout and the specific locations of particular graves. They would proceed directly to predetermined sites without the hesitation or searching behavior that would characterize random grave robbing. Their activities followed ritualistic patterns that involved the careful removal and replacement of specific amounts of soil from designated burial locations. Most disturbing were Fletcher's descriptions of the visitors themselves. While darkness and distance prevented detailed identification, He noted that the figures moved with coordination that suggested advanced planning and shared understanding of their objectives. They would work in complete silence, communicating through gestures that indicated familiarity with established procedures. Fletcher's documentation revealed that the cemetery disturbances coincided with increased mortality rates at the asylum, particularly among patients housed in the Eastern Wing. The groundskeeper had maintained careful records of burial requests from Millbrook, noting discrepancies between official death certificates and the actual condition of remains delivered for interment. Bodies arriving from the asylum often showed signs of post-mortem examination that extended far beyond standard medical procedures. Fletcher's limited knowledge of anatomy prevented detailed analysis, but he noted consistent patterns of incision and tissue removal that suggested systematic harvesting of specific organs and tissues. The groundskeeper's records also documented unusual requests from asylum administrators regarding burial procedures. Beginning in the 1870s, Millbrook officials had insisted on specific grave locations for their deceased patients, often requesting sites that deviated from the cemetery's standard organizational system. These special burial areas were concentrated in sections of the cemetery that provided easy access to the underground limestone formations that characterized the region's geology. Fletcher's investigation of these geological connections had led him to discover that several graves in the asylum section were connected to natural cave systems through carefully concealed openings. These connections had been deliberately created through excavation that removed portions of coffin bottoms and created direct pathways between burial sites and the underground chambers. The groundskeeper's most significant discovery concerned the true identity of some individuals buried in asylum graves. Cross-referencing burial records with local death certificates revealed that several graves contained remains that did not correspond to the individuals officially interred at those locations. Bodies had been substituted with remains of unknown origin, while the actual deceased patients had apparently been diverted to undocumented destinations. Fletcher's investigation had also revealed the existence of unmarked burial sites throughout the cemetery grounds. These graves contained remains that showed evidence of deliberate preservation techniques that extended far beyond standard embalming procedures. The bodies had been treated with chemical compounds that maintained tissue integrity for extended periods, suggesting purposes that required long-term preservation of anatomical specimens. The groundskeeper's final entries, written in early 1887, expressed his growing fear that the activities he had documented were accelerating towards some predetermined culmination. The frequency of nocturnal disturbances had increased dramatically following Jeremiah Voss's arrival at the asylum, and Fletcher had begun observing coordinated activities that involved multiple locations simultaneously. Most troubling was Fletcher's discovery that his own surveillance activities had been detected by the nocturnal visitors. Evidence suggested that his movements were being monitored and that his documentation efforts had attracted unwanted attention from parties whose identities remained unknown. Dr. Brennan's synthesis of the accumulated evidence led him to a disturbing realization that the events at Millbrook represented the culmination of a decades-long process rather than recent institutional failures. The documentation provided by Meredith's journal and Fletcher's cemetery records revealed a systematic operation that had been carefully orchestrated since the asylum's founding, with each ministerial patient serving as a catalyst for increasingly complex activities. The pattern became clear through Brennan's chronological analysis of patient admissions, mortality rates, and cemetery disturbances. Each clerical figure committed to the Eastern Wing had possessed specific theological knowledge that appeared to be essential for the progression of whatever process was unfolding at Millbrook. Their backgrounds revealed expertise in areas of religious scholarship that extended beyond conventional pastoral duties into more esoteric realms of spiritual practice. Reverend Thorne's academic credentials included extensive study of medieval ecclesiastical texts and early Christian mysticism. His personal library, confiscated upon admission, contained volumes on subjects that contemporary religious authorities considered heretical or dangerous. Similarly, the ministers who had preceded and followed him possessed specialized knowledge in areas such as ancient liturgical practices, pre-Christian religious traditions, and theological interpretations that deviated significantly from mainstream denominational teachings. Jeremiah Voss's background proved particularly significant in this context. Prior to his mental deterioration, he had been recognized as a scholar of comparative religion with particular expertise in the intersection of Christian doctrine and pre-Columbian spiritual practices. His academic work had focused on the adaptation of indigenous religious concepts within colonial missionary activities. Research that had taken him to remote areas of Kentucky where he had documented surviving elements of Native American ceremonial traditions. Brennan's investigation revealed that Voss had spent considerable time in the region surrounding Millbrook during the 1870s, conducting ethnographic research among the scattered remnants of Cherokee and Shawnee communities that had maintained hidden enclaves in the area's cave systems. His published papers described religious practices that involved the use of underground chambers for ceremonial purposes, rituals that bore disturbing similarities to the activities Fletcher had observed in the cemetery. The convergence of these elements suggested that the asylum's location had been deliberately chosen for reasons that extended beyond the practical considerations documented in official records. The proximity to extensive cave systems, the presence of limestone formations with specific mineral compositions, and the historical significance of the area as a site of indigenous religious activity appeared to be factors that had influenced the institution's establishment. Brennan's analysis of geological surveys revealed that the cave systems beneath Millbrook connected to a vast underground network that extended throughout the region. These formations had been known to early European settlers who had documented their use by Native American populations for ceremonial purposes that involved practices the colonists had found deeply disturbing. Missionary reports from the colonial period described rituals that appeared to involve communication with deceased tribal members and attempts to influence the boundary between life and death. The asylum's architectural design, when viewed in light of this historical context, revealed features that suggested awareness of the site's unique properties. The eastern wing's positioning aligned precisely with underground chambers that possessed exceptional acoustic characteristics, creating natural amplification effects that could transmit sound across vast distances through the cave network. The building's foundation incorporated elements that appeared designed to facilitate rather than prevent access to the subterranean formations. Most significantly, Brennan discovered that the asylum's original charter had been influenced by individuals whose backgrounds suggested knowledge of the site's historical significance. The founding board of directors included members with documented interests in spiritualism, mesmerism, and other practices that contemporary medical authorities considered pseudoscientific. Their correspondence revealed discussions about the therapeutic potential of environmental factors that were never explicitly defined in official documentation. The implications of these discoveries forced Brennan to confront the possibility that Millbrook had been established not as a conventional medical facility, but as a site for experimental activities that required both institutional cover and access to specific geographical features. The systematic admission of ministerial patients with specialized knowledge suggested a deliberate effort to accumulate the theological expertise necessary for some predetermined objective. The timing of recent events indicated that this objective was approaching fruition. The behavioral synchronization among Eastern Wing patients, the acceleration of cemetery disturbances, and the increasing complexity of underground activities all suggested preparation for an event that would require the coordinated participation of all elements within the established network. Brennan's growing understanding of the situation at Millbrook left him facing a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the lives of hundreds of patients under his care. The events that would forever define Millbrook State Asylum began to accelerate during the first week of March 1887, when Dr. Brennan observed fundamental changes in the behavioral patterns that had characterized the Eastern Wing for the previous 2 years. The synchronized morning observations at the windows ceased abruptly on March 3rd, replaced by activities that suggested the patients were preparing for some imminent occurrence. Jeremiah Voss, despite his advanced age and documented physical frailty, began demonstrating capabilities that contradicted every principle of geriatric medicine. The elderly minister moved through the wing with purposeful energy, organizing his fellow patients into configurations that bore no resemblance to conventional therapeutic activities. His cognitive clarity had not only returned, but appeared enhanced beyond his documented baseline, suggesting neurological improvements that medical science could not explain. The other Eastern Wing residents responded to Voss's guidance with coordination that indicated shared understanding of complex instructions. Patients who had previously required assistance with basic functions began performing tasks that demanded fine motor control and sequential reasoning. They worked together to rearrange furniture, create specific spatial arrangements, and prepare materials whose purposes remained unclear to the asylum staff. Brennan's attempts to document these activities were hampered by the patient's apparent awareness of his surveillance efforts. They would modify their behaviors when observed directly, resuming normal institutional routines until his attention was diverted elsewhere. This suggested not only restored cognitive function, but also tactical thinking that indicated deliberate concealment of their true objectives. The asylum's remaining staff members began reporting unusual phenomena that extended beyond the Eastern Wing. Night attendants described sounds emanating from the building's lower levels that resembled human voices engaged in coordinated recitation. The acoustic properties of these vocalizations suggested large numbers of participants, though head counts consistently confirmed that all patients remained in their designated quarters. Temperature fluctuations throughout the facility created atmospheric conditions that defied the building's heating systems. Certain areas would become uncomfortably warm, while adjacent spaces remained frigid, creating microclimates that seemed to shift according to patterns that corresponded to the patient's activities. The asylum's mechanical systems showed no malfunctions that could account for these variations. Most disturbing were the reports from attendants who had attempted to investigate the source of the nocturnal sounds. Several staff members described becoming disoriented while navigating familiar corridors, finding themselves in areas of the building they could not identify despite years of employment at the facility. These episodes were accompanied by sensory distortions that included visual phenomena resembling shadows moving independently of their sources. Brennan's investigation of these reports led him to discover that the building's architectural features had been subtly modified during the nighttime hours. Walls showed evidence of temporary alterations that created new passages and chambers, modifications that would disappear by morning as if they had never existed. The construction techniques involved appeared to manipulate the limestone foundations in ways that suggested knowledge of geological properties that exceeded conventional engineering expertise. The underground network that connected the asylum to the surrounding cave systems showed increased activity during this period. Fletcher's cemetery observations revealed coordinated movements that involved dozens of participants working simultaneously across multiple locations. The scope of these operations indicated organizational capabilities that extended far beyond the asylum's documented personnel. Local authorities began receiving reports from residents of the surrounding countryside describing unusual phenomena that coincided with the asylum's activities. Livestock exhibited behavioral disturbances that included synchronized movements and vocalizations that resembled the patterns observed among Millbrook's patients. Wells and springs throughout the region showed mineral content changes that suggested alterations in the underground water systems. The town of Millbrook itself experienced disruptions that forced many residents to temporarily relocate to neighboring communities. Electrical systems failed despite clear weather conditions, and telegraph communications became unreliable due to interference that technical experts could not explain. The local physician reported an unusual number of patients presenting with symptoms that resembled those documented among asylum residents. Brennan's analysis of these regional effects revealed that they radiated outward from Millbrook in patterns that suggested the asylum served as the focal point for influences that extended across a significant geographical area. The timing and intensity of the phenomena indicated that whatever process had been developing at the institution was approaching a critical phase that would affect far more than the immediate facility. On March 15th, Brennan made the decision to document his findings in a comprehensive report that he intended to submit to state authorities. However, his attempts to communicate with officials outside the immediate area were frustrated by the same technical difficulties that had affected other regional communications. The asylum appeared to be effectively isolated from external oversight at the precise moment when such supervision was most critically needed. The convergence of all documented factors suggested that the events at Millbrook were building toward a culmination that would occur within days rather than weeks. The final entries in Dr. Brennan's journal, discovered by state investigators 3 weeks after the events of March 21, 1887, provided the only coherent account of what transpired during Millbrook State Asylum's final operational day. The superintendent's meticulous documentation ceased abruptly at 4:17 a.m., leaving investigators to piece together the subsequent events through physical evidence and the fragmented testimonies of the few survivors found in the surrounding countryside. The morning of March 21st had begun with atmospheric conditions that defied meteorological explanation. Despite clear skies and seasonal temperatures, a dense fog had settled over the asylum grounds, creating visibility conditions that prevented observation beyond a few yards. This phenomenon appeared localized to the immediate area surrounding Millbrook, as neighboring communities reported normal weather patterns throughout the day. Brennan's final observations described the complete transformation of the Eastern Wing's patient population. The individuals who had spent months in various stages of cognitive impairment now moved with coordination and purpose that suggested not only restored mental faculties, but enhanced capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. Their activities followed patterns that indicated shared knowledge of complex procedures that had never been taught within the institutional setting. The synchronized behaviors that had characterized the wing for years culminated in a coordinated effort that involved every patient, staff member, and apparently every individual who had ever been associated with the asylum's operations. Brennan noted the presence of figures he recognized as former employees who had departed under mysterious circumstances. Individuals who moved through the facility as if they had never left their positions. The building itself appeared to respond to these activities through structural changes that violated every principle of architectural stability. Walls became permeable, allowing passage between areas that had previously been separated by solid barriers. The limestone foundations seemed to flow like liquid, creating new passages and chambers that connected the asylum's interior to the vast underground network that extended throughout the region. Most significantly, Brennan documented the emergence of individuals from the cave systems who bore no resemblance to any documented patients or staff members. These figures appeared to represent multiple historical periods, their clothing and physical characteristics suggesting origins spanning several centuries. Their presence indicated that the asylum's activities had somehow bridged temporal boundaries in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of death and consciousness. The convergence of all these elements occurred at precisely 4:17 a.m., the moment when Brennan's documentation ceased. Physical evidence discovered by investigators suggested that this timing corresponded to a geological event that affected the entire underground network. Seismic monitoring stations throughout Kentucky recorded disturbances that indicated massive structural changes within the region's cave systems, though the specific nature of these alterations remained unclear. When state authorities finally gained access to the asylum on March 24th, they encountered a facility that bore little resemblance to the institution described in official records. The building's interior had been fundamentally altered, with new architectural features that appeared to have been constructed from materials that did not match any known building substances. The eastern wing had been completely transformed into a series of chambers whose purposes could not be determined through conventional analysis. The patient population had vanished entirely, leaving no trace of their departure or destination. Personal belongings remained undisturbed in their quarters, and medical records showed no indication of authorized releases or transfers. The absence of 214 individuals, including patients and staff members, represented the largest unexplained disappearance in American institutional history. The underground network revealed evidence of activities that had culminated in the creation of chambers whose construction techniques defied engineering explanation. These spaces contained artifacts that suggested occupancy by populations whose cultural characteristics did not correspond to any documented historical groups. The preservation of organic materials within these chambers indicated environmental conditions that should not have been possible given the geological characteristics of the region. Fletcher Cemetery showed similar anomalies, with burial sites that had been systematically emptied without disturbing the surrounding soil or grave markers. The missing remains numbered in the hundreds, representing decades of interments that had apparently been relocated to undetermined destinations. The precision of these excavations suggested techniques that exceeded contemporary archaeological capabilities. The official investigation, conducted by a joint commission of state and federal authorities, concluded that Millbrook State Asylum had been destroyed by unknown causes that resulted in the complete loss of its population. The facility was sealed and abandoned, with the surrounding area designated as unsuitable for future development due to geological instability. Dr. Brennan's journal remained the primary source of information about the asylum's final months, though investigators noted that many of his observations could not be corroborated through physical evidence. The superintendent's fate, like that of the 214 individuals who had comprised Millbrook's community, remained officially undetermined, leaving questions that would haunt American psychiatric medicine for generations to come. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.